Hello, everybody. I'm back, and my my isolation hairdo is getting terrible. I need a haircut, but hey, what can we do? We're all in the same boat at the moment, but not necessarily in the same storm, as I saw a quote say on social media earlier on today. Anywho, here we go with another couple of chapters of my novel, The Kraken's Curse. We are here. We are reading from part 2 now. That's where we're at, and we're on chapters 12 and 13. So here we go. Chapter 12, Autumn. It was quiet on the seashore. The tourists had left and the boats and fishing vessels had retreated into the harbour. Autumn was setting in fast, and everywhere around were signs of its touch. The leaves on the trees had fallen, so that the forest at Pearl Cliff Harbour was bare and lifeless, the golden globe at its centre covered in a light dusting of golden brown leaves. The sea was still dark in its mysterious shade of blue, but it was colder now, much colder. Nobody dared to venture into its embracing arms for fear of catching a chill. Even the fishermen were wary of the cold weather. Autumn was the time of year when they cut back on their catch and suffered the consequences. Across the sea, fish could be seen skittering on the waves and jumping in and out of the rock pools, basking in their newfound safety. The paths through the forests and along the cliff tops were clear and clean. The fallen leaves had been raked into separate piles along the route. Occasionally, families passed by with their children, and they took delight in jumping and kicking in the leaves. Further along the coast, the village of Studmore was almost silent. Now that autumn was upon them, the villagers had no longer ventured out of their houses in the early morning light. The streets seemed deserted as everyone waited for that one special day of the year. The top of the cliff face was bare and deprived of vegetation, and the only thing that marked the horizon was a single dwelling in the middle of the cliff-top expanse. The village of Copse, a little further inland, was also accustoming itself to the autumn weather. The brightly painted houses looked faded and washed out in the daytime, and the streets were dark at night. Even the town of Swagger had slowed in its movements. The ferry that took tourists across Poole Harbour was slower than usual, and the beaches were deserted. The sun shone for a little each day, but it was soon engulfed in the darkness of the evening. Autumn had definitely fallen soft and still and quiet. Everyone was lost in its beauty. Everyone was alive in the browns and the reds, and they were the colours of the season. Chapter 13. The Village Show. The sky awoke to the sound of bird call as the sun rose behind the chimney tops of the many terraced houses in the village of Studmore. The dew from the grass sparkled in the morning light, and the leaves danced in the slight breeze. It was November, and autumn had well and truly set in. The trees were bare, and the land was starting to show the first signs of winter. Along with autumn came the village fair, the one time of the year when everyone united in a celebration of everything British. For several weeks now, lorries had been coming and going along the tight cobbled streets. Some were delivering the stalls on which the produce would be sold. Others were delivering the fairground attractions that would keep the children amused. Then, each morning, the men from the village, the husbands and the sons, would leave their houses and make for the village green. They would spend their time setting up the stalls and making sure everything was clean and pristine. The grass had already been neatly mowed in tight lines, and the leaves had been cleared away. Everything was ready. The morning of the show dawned cool and fresh and crisp. Each street in the village had been strung with flags and posters, and everyone was directed to the village green. Arthur Boston slowly padded down the cobbled street, past the park, kicking a pile of leaves absent-mindedly as he went. It was 3 months now since his visit to Megan, and ever since the story had been kicking around in his head. He felt sorry for her. He was certain about that. It was a horrible thing that her mother had done, but he also thought about the captain. He was sure that the captain was involved in the mystery in some form, and although it pained him to admit it, he couldn't rule out that he might have been involved in James Tindersley's death as well. Arthur knew what he must do today. He had ventured into the village because of the fair. He, like everyone else, had felt a pull to an old tradition, and of course he wanted to experience the thrills. He knew this would be one of the only times that none of the villagers would care about his presence, the one time that some of them might even greet him and treat him like a proper villager. Yes, he would be the first to admit that he had a hard outer shell, was prone to be a little fiery on response and to dismiss people's dreams and beliefs, but he had grown these feelings because of his isolation. He had been away from that close community for so long during his time in the city that it seemed strange when he returned to the village. Today was the day it would change, though. Today he was sure of it. At the end of Main Street was an ageing building with paint that was peeling from its walls. Above the downstairs window hung a flimsy wooden sign, rotten with age, that marked the building as the King's Head Pub. From an upstairs window, the curtains were drawn back and a dimly lit room was visible. The window was pulled back and was pulled upwards, letting the morning breeze enter, and the shadow of a person stood before it. They were waiting for something. Something in particular that they knew was going to happen. At a precise time, someone would walk around the corner and cross the road on their way to the village fair. They would cross the road to avoid the dark pub and its inhabitant. They would be wary without even knowing it. The person emerged from the blackness and stood in full view of the window. He was an ageing man with long, straggly hair and grey, wiry whiskers. To most people, he would seem a strange man. His clothes and his appearance reminded one greatly of the local tramp or of the rag and bone man. Nobody would have expected that he was the landlord of this damp and dangerous place, that he had to throw the rebellious customers out late at night, and that single-handedly he had to clean glasses, sweep the floor and serve the drinks. Presently the air and a tense atmosphere was interrupted by the faint chiming of a cuckoo clock that marked the hour of 11. It was at that precise moment that the figure in the window squinted and stared at the corner of the street, just as a short man with a pinstriped suit and who was clearly shaven rounded the corner and crossed the road. Crossing the road and rounding the next corner, Arthur was surprised when a beautiful sight met his eyes. The village green was alive with colour. There were red tents, blue tents, green tents, and tents of every shape and description. People were buzzing in and out of the various displays, some carrying produce from the fruit and vegetable show, and others carrying the various things that they had bought during their time at the fair. Marking the middle and the focal point was the main arena and the announcement stand. Upon the stand was a single microphone, and behind it a small booth where the person who controlled all the equipment sat. Even from this distance, Arthur could hear when a voice echoed down the microphone, though he couldn't tell what the voice was saying, and he was very surprised when people started to flock to the space in front of the announcement stand. This, thought Arthur, was it. Increasing his pace to a slight jog, he made his way down the hill towards the village green. The crowd was growing larger by the minute, and they were all there to listen to him. Upon arriving at the green, Arthur headed straight through the crowd to the announcement stand, climbed the steps and grabbed the microphone. The crowds were instantly silent. They had sensed Arthur's arrival and were waiting to hear what he had to say. Over the past few months they had become cautious as to what he was doing in the village, and why he had returned. The villagers had always been wary of the Boston family, and now was no exception. However much they wanted to hear what Arthur had to say, they kept their distance. "Welcome, friends," Arthur began, "to our wonderful village fair this crisp autumn morning. I'm sure you are all enjoying the entertainment on offer, but I would just like to take this opportunity to explain to you my reasons for being here, and to ask for your assistance." Several people in the crowd coughed, and some others started to walk away, but the majority listened respectively. "As you know, I returned to this village several months ago. The reason I returned was because I heard news of my father's mysterious disappearance. I told myself that I must return and solve the mystery, that I was the only one who could do this. Now, even more of the villagers started to move away, not wanting to endure any more sob stories about George Boston. But still, Arthur carried on. I know my father had many friends in this village. There were those who he had grown up with since childhood, and those who he had met later in life. Unfortunately, while I have been in this village, I have had good reason to suspect that some of my father's friends played a significant part in the mystery. I discovered upon my return that the Reverend James Tindersley had tragically passed away, and I also discovered that the sea captain Jonathan McCrae was suspect of playing a part in a certain murder, while under the influence of some unidentifiable object. Many of the people in the crowd were getting confused. They didn't understand what Arthur was talking about. Yes, they had read the newspaper story about Captain McCrae and how his boat had been sunk in high winds, but that was years ago. What significance did it have now? But you see, Arthur was not telling the villagers the whole story. He preferred greatly to keep the most intimate facts to himself, and so he ended the speech with a plea for help from those who surrounded him. "Please," he finished, "I'm asking that if you have any information at all about my father, that you contact me and tell me all you know. I feel that at this point my quest needs any information that I could gain, and to prove greatly critical it will be to my investigations." Arthur left the stand, and the crowd started to disperse. Gradually the noise grew again, and the amusements whirred back into action. Almost nobody gave a second thought as to what Arthur had said, and why should they? For this was Arthur's quest, and who was he to have arrived here and to reign on such a prestigious day? In fact, there was only one person who was now ready and armed with information. Standing towards the back of a small group of people and leaning silently against a tree was a thin man with long straggly hair and grey wiry whiskers. It was hard to understand why this particular person was here, for he looked extraordinarily out of place. His eyes were hard and pale, and they seemed to be searching for something. Momentarily his gaze fell upon Arthur Boston as he walked from the microphone stand and joined the crowds. As quickly as lightning, before Arthur had a chance to disappear, the man moved from his position and jogged towards the crowd of people. He tapped Arthur lightly on the shoulder and was not at all surprised by the reaction. "Kindly refrain from making me jump so," Arthur spat in a distant tone. He was not concentrating on what he was saying, but he had just noticed who it was that had shocked him in the first place. He did not know who this man was, but he definitely reminded him of someone, for the wiry whiskers were similar and the eyes had the same hard stare, but to whom they belonged he did not know. "I'm sorry to have stopped you so suddenly," the man spoke, "but I did not want you to disappear before I had a chance to speak to you." "Who are you?" Arthur replied, as though it was not a very interesting question. "I'm Paul McRae. My brother is the sea captain Jonathan McRae." Arthur smiled. "I knew there would be a connection at some point. Some distant relation or a friend who would dish the dirt, so to speak. All I can tell you," Paul continued, "is that I have something of great importance to you." Paul McRae beckoned to Arthur and asked if he would accompany him back to his pub at the top of the village green. Arthur was aware that he had passed this pub on the way here, but he was also aware that Paul had been watching his every step from the bedroom window. Perhaps if he had known, he might have thought more about what Paul was asking and what the consequences might be. The front door was encased in a flaking green paint, and it opened into a wide bar area with seating and a small radio in the corner. The room looked greatly out of date and void of any regulars who might perhaps drop in for a drink. Paul McRae seemed to be the only person who called this place home nowadays. It was interesting for Arthur, looking around the room, to see all the dark canvases and the fading sea paintings that adorned the walls. The bar was dark and silent. It had an eerie feel and an underlying tone of deceit. Slowly, Arthur made his way towards the dusty bar stool and sat down. Paul reached for a bottle of whiskey from the shelf and first poured a glass for himself, before then pouring one more and placing it down in front of Arthur. The two then proceeded into light conversation, which of course would not last for long. "Your father was a very dear friend of my brother's," Paul spoke, his dulcet tones echoing around the room. "I felt that your father was the only person to stand up for my brother when he was a victim of hearsay." Arthur held his position strongly. He admired Paul's confidence, but somehow he couldn't believe him. But on the other hand, I have had a different outlook on the situation." "Yes, well, you would. It was always the wrong piece of information with you. Someone else's fault, poor little rich Boston boy. Don't have no idea what he's talking about." There it was. Paul had cracked, but even Arthur had to admit that he was surprised at how quickly it had happened, for it had only taken a few minutes. He was about to open his mouth and speak when he noticed Paul reaching for another bottle of whiskey. Arthur knew that getting Paul drunk wouldn't make the situation any better, and so without thinking he reached out and wrapped his hand around the bottle just as Paul's fingers approached it. Paul swung around and threw a punch that missed Arthur by inches. It was not safe here, and at that very moment Arthur wondered why on earth he had taken Paul up on the offer. Paul was rounding the corner now, swearing and knocking a glass to the floor as Arthur managed to dive under a table. "You annoying little man," his voice rang out. "You're going to pay for what you've done to my brother, for the torture that you've caused him." Arthur knew that he couldn't be scared, that he must get the upper hand, but as he cowered under the small table, even he couldn't stop himself from shaking. Paul was walking around the outside of the room now, and as he walked he knocked over tables and shouted, "You're under one of these, Boston! Come out now and fight like a man!" It was then that he passed close to Arthur's right hand. Upon the floor lay a half-broken bottle, and if he was quick, Arthur could reach out and grab it, put it back before Paul approached. Quickly, like a fox, a hand darted out from under the table and grabbed the bottle. Seconds later, footsteps passed by and a shriek of pain rang around the room as Arthur struck Paul's leg with the broken bottle. "I'll kill you, Boston!" he screamed as the table above Arthur flew into the air. "Remember, Boston, you're dead!" Two large hands grabbed Arthur's arms and pushed him against the wall. He wriggled and squirmed beneath the grip, but he couldn't break free. As Paul's hands held him flat against the wall by his neck, he felt his breathing increase. Paul had won, and now Arthur would surely die. If there was only one more way out, Arthur could convince Paul. If only there was one more way that Arthur could convince Paul, one way that would secure his escape. "Boston, you're going to die," Paul spat into Arthur's face. "My brother has done so much for this community. How dare you return after such a time and accuse him of being part of things you don't understand? If I were you, I would run. I would run and never come back, before it's too late." Arthur held his breath and tried to ignore the words that were ringing in his ears. He had to summon up all his courage for what came next. He knew it would either be freedom or certain death. Taking as deep a breath as possible, Arthur managed to splutter out a few words in response. Your brother killed a man." It was as if an invisible key had unlocked Paul's grip. With a bump, Arthur fell to the floor, panting and spluttering. He was shocked, Paul whispered in a completely different tone. His boat had just been destroyed and he was not himself. Arthur was amazed. He had always known about the rumour referring to what the captain had done, but now he was about to find out for certain. "So, you're not denying it?" Arthur spluttered, his breathing just back to normal, but shocked all the same. "No, it's true," Paul replied without emotion in his voice. "Who?" Arthur continued. He knew he only needed to say a single word. "It would be wrong for me to divulge that information. You should go and find my brother. It's up to him if he wants to confess or not." Arthur was really shocked. He couldn't believe he had just received the proof he needed from the captain's own brother. His plan was all coming together perfectly. Captain McCrae was now fully in the frame, and as Arthur stood in the wreckage of Paul's bar, he made a crucial decision. The shock had rooted him to the spot, but at that single second he knew what he must do. He must find the Captain McCrae, and he must get him to confess by any means possible. So that's chapter 13 of The Kraken's Curse. Tomorrow, 2 more chapters. I'll be back here to read chapters 14 and 15, including Captain McCrae's confession. So I hope that you will be able to join me tomorrow evening at about 6 p.m.